The day Margaret Sorrells moved into Sunrise Gardens assisted living, she brought 3 things. An overnight bag with 4 days of clothes. A photograph of her and Ray on the rim of the Grand Canyon in 1989, the summer before his hair went fully gray. And a brass key on a loop of garden twine that she'd found inside an envelope at the bottom of her jewelry box, 2 weeks after his funeral. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Ray's handwriting was on the front of the envelope. Her name, then below it, when the time is right. She didn't know what the key opened. She hadn't had time to find out. Derek had organized the move in 4 days. Sunrise Gardens sat on the east side of Clarkton, Ohio, behind a low brick wall and a row of ornamental pear trees that bloomed white every April. From the outside, it looked like a respectable inn. Inside, it smelled like synthetic lavender over something else underneath that the lavender was working hard to cover. Margaret's room was on the 2nd floor, facing the parking lot. The window had a narrow ledge where afternoon sun came in for 2 hours each day. She set Ray's photograph on the ledge the first morning. She tied the brass key to the handle of her overnight bag so she could see it whenever she needed to. The room had everything it required and nothing she wanted. A bed, a chair, a small dresser, a television she didn't turn on. A whiteboard near the door where the staff wrote the day's date each morning in blue marker. She appreciated the whiteboard. After Ray died, she'd sometimes lost track of the day, not from any failure of memory, but because grief removes ordinary anchors. The whiteboard gave her somewhere to start. The other residents were mostly kind. 2 doors down lived a woman named Helen who'd been a music teacher and who hummed constantly, fragments of songs Margaret sometimes recognized. A man named Gerald worked crossword puzzles in the common room every afternoon at the pace of someone with nowhere to be. A woman named Bet had grown up in Clarkton the same decade as Margaret and had worked, it turned out, at the same insurance firm for 6 of those years, though they'd never once crossed paths. Margaret had been a bookkeeper for 37 years at Clarkton Insurance and Casualty. She'd started there at 26, 2 years after marrying Ray, and she'd stayed through 3 owners, for office managers, and 1 complete renovation of the building in 1994 that left the staff working out of a trailer for 11 weeks. She was not someone who abandoned what she'd committed to. Ray had run a small plumbing business. Nothing fancy. 2 trucks and a rotating crew of 4 that expanded to 7 during good years and contracted back to 3 during slow ones. He was a man who worked with his hands, kept his word, and came home every evening smelling like pipe joint compound, which sounds unpleasant, but which Margaret had associated with safety for so long she'd stopped noticing it. They had a house on Birchwood Court, a 1/4 acre with a vegetable garden. Ray tended like it was his second job. They raised their 3 children in that house. Sent all 3 to college, which required refinancing the mortgage twice, a fact Ray mentioned only once and never again. Derek was the oldest. He'd done well vice president of regional sales for a medical supply company, which meant good suits, frequent travel, and the specific confidence that comes from being the person who always has the solution. Paula was 44, a tax accountant in Columbus with her husband and 2 teenage daughters. She was careful, quiet, and tended to agree with Derek in group settings because it was easier. Nathan was 40, the youngest, a software architect in Seattle who called on birthdays and Christmas, and sometimes in between when something reminded him of home. Ray had a stroke in March, 18 months before Derek drove Margaret to Sunrise Gardens. He was in the vegetable garden when it happened, staking the early tomatoes. The neighbor's dog found him. Margaret was inside paying bills. She spent 11 days at the hospital and then 3 weeks in a kind of suspended grief that felt less like sadness and more like standing in a room where all the furniture had been moved in the night. Everything was technically in its place, but nothing was where she expected. She kept reaching for things that weren't there. His coffee mug in the dish rack. His reading glasses on the end table. The sound of his truck in the driveway at 6:05. She managed. She had always managed. She cleared the hospital bills, updated the accounts, contacted Ray's business partner about the trucks. She ate regular meals and kept the garden going because the tomatoes didn't know Ray was gone, and neither did the zucchini, and someone had to deal with the zucchini. She saw her doctor every 3 months, as she always had. She drove herself to the grocery store, to church, to lunch with her friend Pauline from the old office. She was fine. Not happy, not whole, but functional in the way that 72-year-old women who have managed their own households for 45 years are functional. She paid her bills on time. She took her medications. She knew exactly where her car insurance cards were. Derek started calling more frequently around October. First just checking in, which was touching. Then the calls got longer and more pointed. Had she eaten well that week? Was she sleeping? Had she thought about whether the house was too much to manage alone? She answered, honestly, yes, mostly, and no, the house was not too much. In November, she left a pot of soup on the stove while she went to check her email and forgot about it for 40 minutes. The soup didn't burn. The stove had an automatic shutoff, a feature Ray had insisted on installing years ago. But when Derek called that evening and she mentioned it offhand, his tone shifted. She also missed a dentist appointment in December. She'd written it on the wrong week in her calendar. She rescheduled the next morning. These two incidents, the soup and the dentist, became Derek's case. He presented it at a family meeting in January, organized with the precision of someone who had been building toward it for months. Paula drove up from Columbus. Nathan joined from Seattle on speakerphone. They sat in Margaret's kitchen, where she had cooked more meals than any of them could count, and Derek laid out his concerns in the measured, reasonable voice he used in boardrooms. She was living alone. She was 72. Ray was gone, and there was no one to notice if something happened. The house required maintenance she couldn't manage. These were not criticisms, he said. These were realities. Margaret listened. She noticed Paula looking at the table. She noticed Nathan hadn't spoken yet. She told them she was fine. She went through her doctor visits, her medication schedule, her social calendar, the garden plans she'd already made for spring. Derek said he'd looked into some options. He'd found a very well-regarded facility on the east side of town. Clean, safe, fully staffed. A room had come available. He'd put a deposit down to hold it. Margaret looked at him. He had already put a deposit down. Paula said, softly, that it was only temporary, just until everyone felt more comfortable. Nathan, from the speakerphone on the table, said it might be worth trying. She asked what temporary meant. Derek said a few months, maybe 6, just to see how she did in a supported environment. She was 72 years old, and she had been keeping herself alive without assistance for 50 years. She looked at her son's face and understood that this was not a conversation. It was a notification. The deposit was already down. Paula had driven 4 hours. Nathan was calling from Seattle. The decision, from Derek's perspective, had already been made. She told them she'd think about it. Derek said the room was only available through the end of the week. She packed over 3 days. She was careful about it because she didn't know how long temporary would last. She brought her books, her reading glasses, her medications, the photograph, and the brass keys she still couldn't account for. She left her garden in February when it was just bare earth and stakes, nothing planted yet, nothing to lose. Derek drove her to Sunrise Gardens on a Thursday morning. He carried her bags inside and spoke warmly to the intake nurse and smiled at the residents in the common room. At the door to her room, he hugged her and said he'd come by that weekend. He came the following weekend, twice in February, once in March. In April, he called to say he had a work trip. Paula called on Sundays, mostly. Nathan called on the 15th of every month, as reliably as a utility bill. Margaret spent her first weeks learning the rhythms of the place. Meals at 7, noon, and 5:30. An activity hour each morning that she attended selectively, going when Helen's music program ran and skipping the rest. She walked the perimeter of the building each afternoon, 2 circuits in good weather, one when it was cold, a habit she'd kept for years on account of her blood pressure. She read 4 books in February. She helped Bet address birthday cards to Betty's grandchildren because Betty's hands shook now. She played gin rummy with Gerald on Thursday evenings and beat him most of the time, which Gerald said was statistically impossible. She was not declining. She was bored, which is a different thing entirely. The letter came on a Tuesday in March, 8 weeks after she'd moved in. It arrived with a bundle of forwarded mail that Derek's wife dropped off once a month, wrapped in a rubber band. Most of it was ordinary. A credit card offer. A magazine she'd forgotten she subscribed to. A letter from her church. The last envelope was from the Wellman County Auditor's office. The return address meant nothing to her at first. She opened it while sitting in the chair by the window with the afternoon sun on her hands. The letter informed her that property taxes on a parcel at 6140 Harlow Road, Wellman County, Ohio, were 2 years in arrears. Total due, $340. The parcel was described as 3 acres of agricultural land with a residential structure. Owner of record, Raymond Harold Sorrells. She read the letter twice. Then she sat with it in her lap and looked out the window at the parking lot. Harlow Road. Ray had taken her on Sunday drives out that way sometimes, in the years before his knees made long walks difficult. She remembered the road because it dead-ended into farmland, and there was almost no traffic, which Ray liked. He'd always slowed down when they passed a certain stretch of it, a stone farmhouse set back from the road. Old, not derelict, just old. He'd never said why he slowed there. She'd assumed he liked looking at old buildings, which he did. But he owned it, or had owned it. 3 acres. A residential structure. Assessed in his name. She held the letter and thought carefully. The estate paperwork Derek's attorney had prepared covered the house on Birchwood Court, the 2 plumbing trucks, 2 bank accounts, and Ray's pension. There was no property on Harlow Road anywhere in those documents. She was a bookkeeper. She had been a bookkeeper for 37 years. She knew, without any drama about it, what the absence of a property from estate documents could mean. That evening she asked the front desk if she could use the telephone for a long-distance call. They brought her to the small meeting room near the entrance. She called the Wellman County Recorder's office. A woman answered, patient and unhurried. Margaret explained what she was looking for. The woman pulled up the parcel address and came back. There were 2 documents on file for 6140 Harlow Road. The first was a deed from 2001, when Ray had purchased the property from an estate sale for $18,000. The second was an addendum filed in 2007, 6 years later, which modified the ownership terms. Margaret asked her to read the addendum. Ray had used a solo practitioner in Wellman County, a woman named Elaine Fraser, whose name Margaret didn't recognize. He had amended the deed to specify that the Harlow Road property would pass directly to Margaret Eleanor Sorrells as sole owner, separate from any joint estate or family trust, upon his death. The addendum had been properly filed. It simply hadn't appeared in the estate proceedings because it was on record at a different county recorder's office, and the estate attorney had searched only Clarkton County records. Raymond Harold Sorrells had bought a piece of land in 2001 and quietly amended its ownership 6 years later to ensure it would go to his wife alone, separate from everything else, separate from the family trust, separate from his children. Margaret asked if a copy could be mailed to Sunrise Gardens. The woman said of course. She sat in the meeting room after the call ended. She turned the brass key over in her fingers. The number stamped into the bow of the key was 114. Ray's note had said, when the time is right. For months into Sunrise Gardens, staring at a parking lot through a window that let in 2 hours of afternoon sun, Margaret Sorrells decided the time was right. She had a savings account Derek didn't know about. It wasn't hidden from any deliberate intention. Ray had simply opened it for her years ago, her own account, for whatever she wanted. She'd been putting small amounts in it for 2 decades. $1,960, as of the last statement she'd received. She called the bank from the meeting room phone on a Wednesday afternoon and asked them to prepare a cashier's check for $340 payable to the Wellman County Auditor's office. Then she called a taxi company. She didn't announce anything to the staff. She didn't call Derek. She packed her overnight bag the same way she'd packed it 4 months earlier, with specific intentions. Medications, reading glasses, for changes of clothes, a flashlight, a box of granola bars she'd been accumulating from the facility's snack cart, one each afternoon since February. Ray's photograph. On the morning she left, she went to the common room and played one last hand of gin rummy with Gerald. She let him win, which felt like the kindest thing she could do. She said goodbye to Helen, who was humming something that might have been Chopin. She gave Bet the rest of her stamps. The taxi arrived at 10 in the morning. A young man named Marcus loaded her bag into the trunk and held the door. She got in. Where to? He asked. She told him 6140 Harlow Road, Wellman County. He entered it into his GPS and told her it would be 40 minutes. She watched Sunrise Gardens recede in the rear window, the ornamental pear trees fully leafed out now, the white flowers long gone. She turned back to face forward. The road east of Clarkton thinned out after the first 20 minutes, gas stations and strip malls giving way to fallow fields and woodlets. Marcus drove without much conversation, which suited her. She watched the landscape shift and tried to remember exactly where Harlow Road branched off the county route. She'd only ever seen it from the passenger seat of Ray's truck, looking at things the way you look at things when someone else is driving without any particular intent. The taxi turned off the county route onto gravel, then down a narrower road marked with a hand-painted sign, Harlow RD. The letters faded to a washed-out black. The farmhouse was at the end of it. Stone and timber, 2 stories, with a steep roof that had held better than the porch. She could see from the road that the porch had lost 2 of its support posts and sagged toward the ground on the left side. The windows on the first floor were all intact, which surprised her. Someone at some point had boarded up the window nearest the front door, and then the boards had rotted and been replaced, and then the replacement boards had rotted too, and now just the original glass remained, cloudy with decades of weather. But there, 3 acres of land surrounded the house. Tall grass and volunteer birch saplings had filled in what might once have been a maintained yard. A collapsed outbuilding stood to the west. A stone wall ran along the eastern property line, low and old, and missing several courses where time had tipped the stones over. The taxi stopped in front. Margaret asked Marcus to wait while she checked on something. She got out and stood on the gravel with her hand in her coat pocket, touching the brass key. The air smelled like mud and last year's leaves, and somewhere underneath those, something older. Old wood. Old stone. The cold breath of a building that had been standing long before she was born. She walked up to the front door. The lock was original iron plate hardware, keyhole visible. She took the brass key from her pocket. It turned. The door was swollen from winter, and she had to press her shoulder against it, but it opened, not with any great resistance. The way things open when they've been waiting long enough. She stood in the doorway. The front hall was dim, the clouded windows filtering the light into something soft and gray. The wood floor was warped in places but solid underfoot. When she stepped onto it, no give, no ominous creak. To her left, a parlor with a stone fireplace. The plaster walls cracked along the corners, but not buckled. To her right, what had been a study, a built-in bookcase lining one wall, empty now, the wood dark from decades of air and shadow. Straight ahead, a kitchen. She moved through each room slowly. The kitchen held a cast iron range she'd need to replace and a pump sink she tested by working the handle. After several long strokes, the handle met resistance. Dry pipes, but the fittings looked intact. She stood at the kitchen's back wall and turned around. The afternoon light came through the 2 windows at a low angle, cutting across the floor in a way that made everything visible, every variation in the grain of the boards, every old repair, every imperfection. That was when she saw it. A faint rectangle in the floor near the kitchen table. A seam, running along the grain of the boards, barely there. 3 feet by 3 feet, approximately. The boards inside the rectangle weren't quite flush with the boards outside it, not obviously, not in a way you'd catch unless you were standing in this particular light, looking for something. She got down on one knee, slowly, pressed her palm flat against the boards inside the rectangle. They gave slightly, a fraction of an inch, as if something beneath them wasn't resting on solid earth. She stayed there for a moment, hand flat, feeling the give. Then she stood, walked back through the hall, and paid Marcus his fare plus the $20 she had in her coat pocket. He asked if she wanted him to call a ride back for her later. She thanked him and said no. She had somewhere to be, and she intended to be here for it. The rectangle in the floor didn't yield anything more that afternoon. Margaret pressed along every edge with her fingers, working slowly from one corner to the next. She found the hinge side after about 10 minutes. 2 old iron hinges set flush into the wood, mortised so cleanly that you couldn't feel them unless you were running your fingertips in exactly the right direction. They were on the wall side. Whatever opened did so by lifting from the center of the kitchen. She tried the brass key along the seam. The key was the wrong size and the wrong shape. Whatever it opened, it wasn't this floor. She had no tools. She looked around the kitchen and found nothing useful on the first pass, then opened the 3 cabinet doors below the pump sink and found, in the back of the lowest cabinet, a short-handled butter knife with a cracked horn handle and a blade worn to a thin curve from decades of sharpening. She worked the blade into the seam on the opening side and pressed. The wood didn't move. The seam was tight, the fit precise, the work of someone who understood joinery. She sat back on her heels and looked at it. Outside, the light was going. The clouded windows turned amber and then gray. She had maybe 40 minutes of daylight left, and she had no electricity, no running water, no blankets, and no bed. She left the rectangle alone for the night. She found the old wood stove in the parlor, a cast-iron box stove with a cracked firebox door that still hinged and closed. There was a cord of split wood stacked along the north wall of the collapsed outbuilding, mostly rotted through, but enough solid pieces underneath to work with. She made 3 trips, carrying an armload each time, and built a fire in the parlor stove using her lighter and a page from the spiral notebook she kept in her overnight bag for lists. The stove drew well. The chimney was clear. Within 20 minutes the parlor was holding heat. She ate 2 granola bars for dinner. She spread her coat on the parlor floor in front of the stove and lay down on it. The floor was harder than anything she'd slept on in 72 years. Her hip complained. She shifted twice, found an angle that hurt least, and stayed there. The building settled around her in the dark. Old stone contracting in the cold, old wood shifting on its joints. She'd expected the sounds to be unsettling, and they weren't. They were just the sounds of something old still holding together. She found them reassuring. In the specific way that things built to last are reassuring when you are a person who has been made to feel like a burden. She slept before 10 o'clock, which surprised her. She hadn't slept before 10 in months. In the morning she walked the property in the early light. 3 acres was not large, but it felt large when you were standing in it alone. The eastern third was open land. Once farmed, she could see the old furrow lines under the grass if she looked at a low angle. The western third was scrub woods, mostly young growth, birch and poplar, with a few older maples at the back edge that were at least 60 years old. The middle third was the house and what had been the yard, now overgrown, and the remains of the outbuilding. Behind the house, on the north side, she found the well. A stone-capped hand-dug well, for feet across, with an iron hand pump that had seized. She worked the pump handle for several minutes, using both hands and her weight, until something gave and the handle moved. Water came up brown and then, after 30 seconds, clear. Cold, very cold, but clear. She cupped her hand under it and tasted it. Clean. She washed her face at the well, filled the water bottle she'd brought from Sunrise Gardens, and went back inside. The first full day she spent cleaning the kitchen. She worked with the butter knife and a rag she'd torn from one of her worn undershirts, scrubbing the grime from every surface, clearing the cabinet shelves of the debris that decades of mice had left, wiping down the walls. She found, in the cabinet beneath the pump sink, a collection of old clay pots that had belonged to whoever last used this kitchen. She left them where they were. They were still useful. She worked around the rectangle in the floor. She didn't ignore it. She thought about it constantly, the way you think about something when you're deliberately not looking at it. But she had no tools and no way to open it, and there was other work to do. On the second day, she walked down Harlow Road. The road went south for about a half-mile before meeting a neighbor's lane. The farmhouse at the end of the lane had been kept up well painted within the last few years, wood piles stacked neatly along the side wall, a garden plot turned and ready for spring planting. A dog announced her arrival from the porch. An elderly man opened the door before she reached the steps. He was in his 80s, thick through the shoulders from a lifetime of outdoor work, with white hair cut close and a face that had spent most of its years in weather. He looked at her the way people in rural areas look at strangers on foot, not unfriendly, just assessing. "I'm Margaret Sorrells," she said. "I've just moved into the stone farmhouse up the road. I wanted to introduce myself." His name was Calvin Witter. He'd been on this road for 81 years. Born in the house he was currently standing in front of. His wife had died 4 years ago. He had a daughter in Columbus who called every Sunday, which he said was plenty. He invited her inside and made coffee. They sat at his kitchen table, and Margaret asked him about the stone farmhouse. He knew it well. He'd known every occupant of it since childhood. The original owner, he said, was a man named Walter Brauer. Came over from Bavaria in 1923, bought the land when it was cheap, built the stone farmhouse himself over the course of 2 years. "Good work," Cal said, tapping the table for emphasis. "That kind of stone and mortar construction, you don't see it anymore, because it takes too long and costs too much, and most people won't do the work." Brauer did it himself, with 2 hired men helping in the summers. He farmed the land for nearly 30 years. Corn, mostly, and some pasture. Kept a few cattle. Quiet man. Didn't come to town often, but when he did he was straightforward and honest. Paid his accounts. In the early 1950s things changed. Cal's expression shifted slightly, The way old people's expressions shift when they're deciding how much to say about something that happened before their full understanding. It was the McCarthy era, he said. Margaret knew the period. A time when having a German surname and a foreign accent and a preference for keeping to yourself was enough to make some people in a small American county nervous, and when nervous people got together, they sometimes made trouble. There were town meetings. Cal had heard about them from his father, who'd attended them uneasily. There was talk about property owned by people with foreign backgrounds, about who was a real American, about loyalty. Nobody dragged Brauer into the specific meeting Cal's father described, but everyone knew who was meant. Brauer stopped coming to town almost entirely after that. He had what he needed on the land. He was self-sufficient, probably more than most. But in 1952, Cal's father noticed that Brauer was doing something unusual. He was making changes to the farmhouse, working inside, taking materials in, doing something structural. When Cal's father asked him about it, Brauer just said he was making some improvements, keeping things safe. Then in the spring of 1953, Brauer seemed easier. Whatever he'd been worried about, whatever he'd been protecting, he'd dealt with it his own way. He never talked about what he'd done. He just farmed his land and kept his peace until 1967, when he died in his sleep at 78. No wife, no children, no will that anyone could find. What happened to the property? Margaret asked. Cal shrugged. County took it for taxes for a while. Then a family from outside the county bought it, didn't do much with it, eventually sold it to someone else. 4 or 5 owners since then. Nobody stayed. Nobody put in any real work. Your husband bought it, didn't he? Cal said. About 20 years ago. Ray Sorrells. I met him once when he came out to check on the place. Seemed like a man who knew what a building was worth. Margaret looked at her coffee cup. He did, she said. He knew exactly what things were worth. She told Cal the basics of why she was there. Not all of it. Not the nursing home or Derek or the fact that her children didn't know she was gone yet. Just that Ray had left her the property and she'd come to see about it. Cal listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once and asked if she had tools. She said she didn't have much. He got up from the table and went out to his barn and came back with a box of basic hand tools: a claw hammer, 2 chisels, a pry bar, a handsaw, a tape measure, and a 5-gallon water jug he filled from his tap. Bring them back when you're done or don't, he said. I'm 81. I'm not climbing ladders anyway. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. She called Paula from Cal's phone before she walked back. Paula answered on the second ring, which told Margaret she'd been waiting. Mom, Derek said you left Sunrise Gardens. He said they called him when you didn't show up for breakfast. A pause. He's upset. I imagine he is. Where are you? Margaret told her. Paula went quiet for a moment. Ray owned a farmhouse. He bought it in 2001 and left it to me specifically. There's a deed on file at the Wellman County Recorder's office if you want to verify it. Another pause. Are you safe? I have running water, a working stove, and a neighbor half a mile away who just lent me a pry bar. I'm quite safe. Derek is going to drive out there. He's welcome to, Margaret said. It's a public road. He came on the 3rd day. The black SUV turned onto the gravel road at around 11 in the morning and stopped in front of the farmhouse. Margaret watched from the kitchen window, her hands still wet from washing the parlor floor. Derek walked the perimeter of the building before coming inside, the way he walked building sites when evaluating a property for his business contacts. She watched him look at the sagging porch, the cloudy windows, the collapsed outbuilding, the overgrown yard. His expression was the expression of a man cataloging deficits. She met him at the door. He looked past her into the front hall. Mom, Derek, this is not safe. Come inside. She stepped back. He followed. She'd cleaned the front hall and the parlor since arriving. The floors weren't what they'd been, but they were clean. The stove in the parlor gave off steady heat. On the small table she'd pulled from the study, she'd set the deed addendum from the county recorder's office, the tax payment receipt, and the original estate documents Derek's attorney had filed. She set her hand flat on the addendum. Your father left this property to me. Not to the family trust, not to his estate generally, to me. He filed this in 2007 at the Wellman County Recorder's office, separate from his main will, specifically because he intended it to be mine alone. Derek picked up the document and read it. He read it the way he read contracts thoroughly, looking for the opening. The estate attorney missed this, he said. He did. That's a problem we'll need to address. The problem that was missed, Margaret said, has now been found and resolved. The back taxes are paid. The property is in my name. There's nothing to address. Derek set the document down. He looked around the parlor, at the stove, the coat spread on the floor from the nights she'd spent before finding a usable mattress in one of the second-floor rooms. He looked at the water jug from Cal's barn. He looked at the flashlight on the windowsill. You're living like this. I'm living in my home. You can't stay here alone. It's not safe. The structure isn't. Ray bought this building 20 years ago because the structure is sound. He was a plumber who spent 40 years in other people's houses. He knew what sound looked like. Mom. Derek rubbed the back of his neck. He did this when he was revising his approach. She'd watched him do it since he was 12 years old. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I'm trying to look out for you. I know that's how you see it. How do you see it? She was quiet for a moment. Not because she was searching for words, she had the words, but because she wanted to say them correctly. I see it, she said, as you making a decision about my life without asking me. You found a facility, you put down a deposit, and then you held a meeting to inform me. That's not looking out for someone. That's managing them. Derek looked at the floor. I was managing the house, he said. The maintenance, the finances, I managed our finances for 37 years. After Dad died, you thought I couldn't do it anymore. And you may have believed that genuinely, which is why I'm not angry at you. But believing something doesn't make it true. She picked up the deed from the table and held it. Your father believed I could do it. He put it in writing in 2007, when he was healthy and clear-minded and had no reason to doubt either of us. He set this aside for me. He knew I'd need it someday, even if neither of us knew why. Derek didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, I'll have an attorney look at the estate records. If the process was incomplete, it should be corrected. You do what you need to do. And you'll stay here. I'll stay here. He left before noon. He didn't look at the house again as he drove away. Paula called that evening. She didn't try to change Margaret's mind. She asked what she needed. The following Saturday, she arrived in her minivan with Margaret's winter clothes, a box of books from storage, her cast-iron skillet, and a bag of groceries she'd chosen without being asked: flour, salt, dried beans, oats, coffee, 2 dozen eggs. She helped Margaret scrub the parlor walls without being asked, and she stayed for lunch, which was fried eggs and toast from bread Margaret had baked in the firebox of the old range, which still worked if you were patient with it. Paula asked, carefully, if Margaret would tell her about the property. Margaret told her what Cal had told her. The German farmer, the McCarthy years, the 1952 modifications to the house, the sealed cellar. Paula looked at the kitchen floor when Margaret described the rectangle. What do you think is in it? I don't know yet, Margaret said. I'm going to find out. She'd spent the days since Derek's visit working through the farmhouse room by room. The study had yielded the most. Behind the lowest shelf of the built-in bookcase, where the wood had shrunk away from the wall over the decades and left a gap, she'd found a collection of old newspapers folded and pressed into the space. Wellman County Gazette, 1951 and 1952. She'd carried them carefully to the kitchen table and spread them out. Most were unremarkable. Local news, farm reports. Weather, an advertisement for a feed store that had probably been gone for 60 years. But in the October 1951 issue, she found a short piece on the 3rd page about a county commissioners' meeting. A group of residents had petitioned the commissioners to review land ownership by what the article called recent foreign-born settlers in the county's agricultural districts. The petition was described as concerned with patriotism and community character. The commissioners had tabled the discussion pending further review. The article named no specific landowners. It didn't need to. And pressed between the pages of the March 1952 issue, she found a photograph. Black and white, printed on thick paper. A man stood in a kitchen. She recognized this kitchen, this room, though the pump sink behind him was newer and the cabinet on the right hadn't yet developed the lean it had now. The man was in his 60s, solidly built, wearing work clothes. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the camera with the composed, undefeated expression of someone who has made his decision and won't be talked out of it. She brought the photograph to Cal Witter on Thursday. Cal looked at it for a long time. That's Walter, he said. That's Walter Brauer. I don't know who took this. He wasn't one for photographs. He handed it back. Where did you find this? In the study, behind the bookcase. Cal was quiet. Then, he left things behind for a reason, you know. A man like Walter, careful as he was if he left something, it was meant to be found. Margaret looked at the photograph in her hands. The man in it looked back at her from 1952 with his hands at his sides and his decision already made. She went back to the farmhouse and took Cal's pry bar into the kitchen. But before she reached the rectangle, she found something she hadn't expected. On the north exterior wall of the farmhouse, half hidden by years of overgrown grass and the remnants of a spirea bush, there was a low wooden door set flush into the stone foundation. About 2 feet tall, 3 feet wide. A root cellar entrance. The wood was rotted through in the center, but the frame was still set in the stone. She pulled the remnants of the door away in pieces and shone her flashlight down the stone steps beyond. 6 steps, then a chamber. Stone walls, stone floor, low ceiling. Old wooden shelving along 3 walls, the shelves sagging but standing. Empty. Every shelf empty. Whatever had been stored here, vegetables, canned goods, the ordinary provisions of a working farm, was long gone. She stood in the root cellar and turned slowly. Stone and air and dust. Nothing hidden, nothing sealed. Just a functional space that had been used and then emptied and then abandoned when the farm was abandoned. She went back out into the afternoon and stood for a moment in the cold air. Brauer had a root cellar for everyday use. Open access, practical, no mystery. And he had something else beneath the kitchen floor, sealed flush. Joinery, so precise it had waited 70 years without anyone noticing it from above. 2 underground spaces. One for what any farmer needed. One for what only Walter Brauer needed, in 1952, when men in his county were holding meetings about people like him. She went back inside and knelt in the kitchen. She worked the flat end of the pry bar into the seam on the opening side, the side away from the hinges. The fit was tight, the wood dense and dry, and it took her 4 attempts to find the depth that gave her any purchase. She pressed down on the bar slowly, using her weight rather than her arm strength, and felt the resistance before she felt the give. The board shifted, a fraction of an inch, then a 1/4 inch, then the gap opened enough to get her fingers under the edge. She set the pry bar down. She gripped the edge with both hands. Cold air came up through the gap, air that had been sealed in place since sometime in 1952, still and cold, and carrying a faint smell she couldn't immediately name. Not decay, not earth, something drier than that. The smell of a closed room. The smell of preserved things. Margaret held the edge and looked at the gap and breathed. She had driven away from Sunrise Gardens 11 days ago with a granola bar collection and a brass key and the specific stubbornness of a woman who had been told what she needed by people who had not asked. She had slept on a parlor floor and pumped water from a seized well and eaten eggs fried on a wood stove and listened to an 81-year-old man tell her about a German farmer who had decided, 70 years ago, that the things worth protecting should be protected where proud and frightened people would never think to look. She lifted the door. The hinges held. The door came up in a single piece, heavy and solid, and she set it back on the kitchen floor beside the opening. Below, stone steps descended into darkness. Not a large space, she could see the walls on 3 sides from where she knelt. The ceiling of the chamber below was perhaps 5 feet from the floor. Small. Intentionally small. Built quickly, built privately, built to be invisible. She reached for her flashlight. The beam went down the steps and across the floor of the chamber and found, immediately, the first thing Walter Brauer had left behind. A wooden crate, heavy-sided, with iron corner reinforcements. Sealed shut with iron latches on each side. Beside it, a leather case about 2 feet wide and 3 feet long, flat, the leather cracked with age but the shape of it intact. And beside the leather case, a tin box with a hasp closure and, through the hasp, a lock. A lock with a keyhole. The keyhole was small, round at the top, narrow below. She reached into her pocket and took out the brass key on the loop of garden twine. She did not put it in the lock yet. She sat at the top of the stairs with the key in her hand and the flashlight aimed down and looked at what Walter Brauer had sealed in 1952 and what Ray Sorrells had known was there without ever telling her, and what 11 days of cold floors and cast iron cooking and borrowed tools had brought her to. She looked at it for a while. Then she went down the steps. The stairs were 6 steps, each one cut from a single piece of limestone. Whoever had laid them had taken care. The edges were still square after 70 years, the surfaces worn smooth in the center from boots that had come down here regularly, and then not at all. At the bottom, Margaret stood still for a moment and let her flashlight move over the chamber. It was small, maybe 10 feet by 8, with a ceiling so low she had to dip her head slightly on the far side where the stone was highest at the entrance and lowest at the back. The walls were fieldstone set in lime mortar, the same construction as the farmhouse above. Dry? She put her hand to the wall and found it cool, but not damp. Brauer had known what he was doing when he built this. He'd chosen the right depth, the right stone, the right drainage. The 3 items she'd seen from above were on the floor, spaced out as if he'd arranged them with some thought about how they would eventually be found. The wooden crate on the left, iron-cornered, about 2 feet square. The leather case flat on the floor in the center, its surface cracked, but its shape held. The tin box to the right, a simple agricultural tin with a hasp closure and the lock through it. She went to the tin box first. The brass key went in cleanly. The lock had been made for it. After 70 years, it turned with resistance, then gave, and the hasp swung free. Inside the tin, wrapped in oilcloth, were papers. She carried the tin up the stairs to the kitchen table and spread them out in better light. There were 3 documents. The first was Walter Brauer's naturalization certificate from 1931, his citizenship paper, creased along the folds, but intact. His photograph on it was the same composed, undefeated face from the photograph she'd found in the study, 20 years younger. The second document was a handwritten inventory, 2 pages in careful English. Numbered items, brief descriptions, the year each was purchased. It was a list of what was in the crate and the leather case, written for whoever would eventually open this room. The third was a letter, for pages, front and back, in the same careful hand. She read it at the kitchen table while the morning light came through the clouded windows. Walter Brauer had written the letter in the spring of 1952, after the county commissioners' meeting, after a man he'd known for 15 years had stopped speaking to him at the feed store, after an unsigned note appeared under his door suggesting he might want to think about selling his land and going back to where he came from. He had come from Bavaria in 1923 with $40 and a set of woodworking tools his father had given him. He had spent 29 years building something on this land. He was not leaving, but he was not a fool either. He had watched what happened in Germany to people who trusted that their neighbors would remain reasonable. He had come to America partly because of what he'd seen of what happens when they don't. So in 1952, when the atmosphere in his county shifted in a direction he recognized, he made a decision. Everything he had that could be taken by a hostile county government, by creditors, by anyone who might try to use the legal system the way the men at those meetings wanted to use it, he would put somewhere safe. Underground. Out of reach. He listed in the letter what he'd put there and why he'd chosen those particular things. He'd been buying pre-1933 American gold coins for years, not as an investment, but as insurance. 31 of them. He'd bought silver pieces as he could afford them, functional items that also held value. 6 paintings he'd made himself over 15 years, which he listed last and briefly, as if he wasn't sure they counted. He'd received a letter from a gallery in Columbus in 1951 expressing interest in showing them. He'd never responded. He didn't trust galleries any more than he trusted county commissioners that particular year. At the bottom of the letter's last page, he'd written, "I am sealing this room because I intend to live here for the rest of my life, and I do not want to spend that life afraid. When I am gone, this belongs to whoever is honest enough and stubborn enough to find it. I hope they use it well." Margaret sat with the letter for a long time. Outside, a crow called once from somewhere near the stone wall. The old range ticked as it cooled. She went back down the stairs. She lifted the lid of the wooden crate. Inside, each wrapped separately in squares of oilcloth tied with cotton string, were the coins. She lifted one out and unwrapped it carefully. A 1927 St. Gaudens double eagle, $20 gold piece, its face still sharp, the figure of liberty on the obverse clear and bright in the flashlight beam. She set it on the floor gently. Unwrapped another. A 1924. Another. A 1921. 31 coins, each in its own oilcloth wrapper. She didn't unwrap them all. She set the 1927 coin back in its wrapper, placed it in the crate, and looked at the leather case. The case had 2 brass clasps, both intact. She opened them and folded back the cover. 6 paintings on gessoed board, each wrapped in its own piece of oilcloth, stacked flat. She lifted the top one and unwrapped it. A winter landscape, roughly 12 inches by 16. Harlow Road in snow, the stone farmhouse in the background, the bare trees along the property line rendered with economy and precision. The sky was the specific pale gray of Ohio. In February, the color of something that can't decide whether to snow again or not. It was an exact sky. She'd seen it every morning for the past 11 days. She turned the board over. On the back, in careful block letters, W. Brauer. Harlow R.D., Winter 1948. She sat on the cellar floor and held the painting in the flashlight beam and looked at it for a long time. 70 years in the dark, and the colors were exactly as Brauer had mixed them in 1948. The oilcloth had done its work. She didn't look at the other 5 that day. She wrapped the winter landscape back in its cloth, closed the leather case, and sat in the cellar with the flashlight dimming slightly as the batteries aged. She wasn't ready to see everything yet. Some things you should approach gradually when you understand their weight. She went up the stairs and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the inventory Brauer had written. Then she walked down Harlow Road to Cal Witter's house and knocked on his door. He came with her back up the road without asking many questions. She showed him the open floor, the stairs, the chamber. He went down carefully, one hand on the wall, and stood at the bottom and moved the flashlight slowly over the crate and the case and the tin with the open lock. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, his whole life. He came back up the stairs. That's his whole life down there. I need help getting the crate up, Margaret said. They got it up together, Cal taking the weight of it on the stairs while Margaret steadied from above. It was heavy. The coins, even small ones, accumulate weight. They set it on the kitchen table. Cal helped her call the County Historical Society from his phone that afternoon. The woman who answered gave her 2 names. A numismatist in Columbus who dealt in pre-1933 American gold coins, and an art historian at Ohio Wesleyan who had been working on a retrospective of Ohio regionalist painters. She called the numismatist first. His name was Arthur Pell. He listened to her description: 31 pre-1933 American gold coins in mixed years, St. Gaudens double eagles, stored in oilcloth for approximately 70 years. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he would like to come see them at his earliest convenience, which turned out to be Thursday. Pell arrived in a sensible sedan and sat at Margaret's kitchen table with white cotton gloves and a loupe and a small digital scale, and spent 2 hours going through the coins one at a time, making notes on a legal pad. He did not speak much while he worked. He had the focused quiet of someone who has found what they came for. When he finished, he set down his pen and looked at Margaret. The coins ranged in grade from very fine to mint state, which he explained was a scale of preservation. The poorest grade in the collection would sell for approximately $2,200. The best grade, a 1924 St. Gaudens that he held up and turned in the light with something close to reverence, would sell for between $9,000 and $11,000, depending on the auction. He totaled his estimates. The 31 coins, sold individually at auction through his firm, would realize between $114,000 and $147,000, depending on the auction climate and the buyers. Margaret wrote the numbers down on the back of Brauer's inventory sheet. She served Pell coffee, and he told her, while he drank it, that coins like these appeared in the market every few years when someone cleaned out an attic or estate. They almost never appeared in this condition. Brauer's oilcloth and the dry sealed chamber had preserved them, as well as a bank vault. He left with Margaret's permission to begin the cataloging process. She kept the 1924 St. Gaudens on the kitchen table. She wasn't sure why. It felt like it should be visible for a while. The art historian came on Saturday. Dr. Carla Voss was in her 40s, drove a car full of art books and research folders, and walked into the farmhouse with the alert, forward-leaning energy of someone expecting to be interested by what she found. She was not prepared for what she found. Margaret brought the paintings up from the cellar one by one and set them on the kitchen table. Dr. Voss unwrapped each one with the same white cotton gloves Pell had worn and stood them against the kitchen wall in a row when she was done. 6 paintings. The Winter Road. A summer field with the stone wall along the eastern edge. A portrait of a draft horse with an expression of immense patience. 2 interior scenes Margaret couldn't immediately place: a kitchen, a barn painted with the same economy and precision as the landscapes. And the 6th, The largest, a panoramic view of the Wellman County Valley from what must have been the top of the hill behind the farmhouse. The farms laid out below in the warm light of an October afternoon, the kind of light Ohio produces for about 3 weeks every year before winter closes it off. Dr. Voss stood back and looked at all 6. She said nothing for about 2 minutes. Then she said, "Do you know anything about Ohio regionalism?" Margaret said not much. Dr. Voss explained it briefly. A loose movement of painters working in rural Ohio between the 1920s and 1950s, working largely outside the gallery system, documenting the agricultural landscape with a specificity and emotional intelligence that had been overlooked for decades and was now being seriously reconsidered. Several painters whose work had sold for almost nothing in estate sales 30 years ago were now represented in major collections. Brauer's work, she said carefully, was not just comparable. It was, in certain technical qualities, the handling of Ohio light, the compositional restraint, the specific emotional register of the interior scenes among the best examples she had seen of the movement's mature period. She would need to bring in a colleague for a second assessment before making any formal claims. She would need time to research Brauer's background and document the chain of ownership. But as a preliminary, personal, off-the-record observation, the 6 paintings together, properly authenticated and placed with the right auction house, would sell for between $360,000 and $440,000. The valley panorama alone might exceed $120,000. Margaret sat down. She hadn't planned to sit down. She simply needed to. Dr. Voss asked if she was all right. "I'm fine," Margaret said. "I just need a moment." She sat at the kitchen table where Brauer had stood for his photograph in 1952 and looked at the 6 paintings lined up against his kitchen wall and thought about a man who had grown up in Bavaria and built a stone farmhouse in Ohio and spent 15 years making paintings that no one ever saw, and then sealed them in the ground because frightened men at a county meeting had made him afraid of losing what was his, and then farmed his land for another 15 years and died at 78 with no heirs and no one to leave anything to. And then Ray had come, in 2001, and driven slowly past on a Sunday afternoon and known the bones of the building were good. She took the brass key from her pocket and set it on the table. Dr. Voss looked at it. Was that the key to the room? To the tin box. The lock on the tin with the letter inside. Margaret turned the key on the table with one finger. "My husband left it for me. He must have found the lock and understood what it was for. He never opened it himself. He left it for me and wrote 4 words on the envelope." "What did he write?" "When the time is right." Dr. Voss looked at her. "Why do you think he didn't open it himself?" Margaret thought about Ray staking tomatoes and driving slowly past this farmhouse on Sunday mornings and refinancing the mortgage twice, without complaint, and opening her a separate account with instructions to use it for whatever she wanted. "Because he knew," she said, "that some things aren't for the person who finds them. They're for the person who needs them." The authentication took 6 weeks. Arthur Pell's firm cataloged and documented the coins. Dr. Voss brought her colleague, a retired professor from Case Western, who spent a full day with the paintings and came away agreeing with her assessment. A Columbus auction house, Harrington and Frew, sent a representative in the 3rd week who walked through the farmhouse and the cellar and listened to the full history and said they would be honored to handle the sale. The County Historical Society sent a researcher to document Brauer's life and work. Cal Witter sat for 3 hours of recorded conversation about the man he'd known as a child, the quiet farmer down the road who kept his peace and made something beautiful in private. The news reached Derek through his attorney, who had heard it from someone at the county recorder's office who had processed the discovery documentation. Derek called on a Tuesday evening. Margaret was in the kitchen eating soup she'd made from the garden beds she'd cleared and planted in the first warm weeks of April. "Mom." A pause. "I'm hearing things. I imagine you are. The paintings. The coins." Another pause. "How much is it worth?" "Enough." She ate a spoonful of soup. "Enough to restore the farmhouse. Enough to live here comfortably for as long as I want to. Enough left over to do something with." "What are you going to do with it?" She set her spoon down. "I'm donating the Birchwood Courthouse to the County Housing Authority for transitional housing for elderly residents who need somewhere to go." She paused. "I'm designating it in Walter Brauer's name. He was a man who understood what it meant to need a place that couldn't be taken from you." The line was quiet for long enough that she thought the call had dropped. Then Derek said, "Mom, I'm sorry." She had been waiting for this, and now that it had arrived, she found she had no prepared response. She had spent 4 months at Sunrise Gardens and 11 days on a parlor floor and 6 weeks of authentication appointments being quietly certain about what she was doing and why, and she hadn't spent much time imagining this exact moment. "I know," she said. "I thought I was helping. I thought you were. I know what you thought. I should have asked you. I should have sat down with you and asked what you needed instead of deciding." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She didn't tell him it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and he was old enough to sit with that. She didn't tell him it didn't matter, because it did matter. What she'd lost was 4 months of her own life, managed like a problem someone else was solving. But she also didn't tell him it was unforgivable, because she'd spent 37 years as a bookkeeper and she understood that the books eventually had to balance, and you couldn't carry a deficit forever without it costing you something. "Come out sometime," she said. "Bring the kids if they want to come. I've got a garden going." She hung up and finished her soup. The auction ran in September. Harrington and Frew held it as part of their Fall American Art and Estate catalog, with a special notation for the Brauer collection that explained the provenance, the Bavarian immigrant, the McCarthy era, the sealed chamber, the 70-year wait. The auction house had understood, correctly, that the story was part of what they were selling. The coins went first. The 1924 St. Gaudens sold for $11,200. The collection total came to $139,000 for $100. The paintings went last. The interior scenes and the horse portrait sold in the $30,000 range. The landscapes went higher. The Winter Road painting sold for $52,000. The October Valley panorama, which the auction house had printed as a full-color plate in the catalog, opened at $60,000 and sold at $114,000 to a private collector from Cincinnati who had grown up in Wellman County and recognized the view. 6 paintings. Total, $397,000. Combined with the coins and the silver pieces, which Pell had also sold through his firm for just over $14,000, the total from Walter Brauer's sealed chamber came to $550,000 for $112 before the auction house's commission. After fees, after taxes properly and carefully calculated, Margaret Sorrells had $389,000. She paid for the farmhouse restoration in full. A contractor from Wellman County who specialized in historic stone buildings spent 4 months on the work. The porch was rebuilt. The roof was properly sealed. The clouded windows were replaced with glass that matched the period. The kitchen was updated carefully, new range, new plumbing, but the pump sink stayed, cleaned and sealed, and used as a secondary basin. The pine floors were sanded and finished. The built-in bookcase in the study was repaired and filled. The kitchen floor door was restored in place. The new contractor fitted it with proper hinges and a recessed pull handle. But Margaret asked him to leave the door open when he was done, just to let the room breathe, she said. She filled Brauer's shelves in the cellar with glass jars of preserved vegetables from her garden in October. Tomatoes, green beans, pickled beets. The things any farmer keeps underground. She hung Brauer's letter, framed under glass, on the kitchen wall where his photograph had been taken in 1952. Beside it she hung the photograph. The composed face, the hands at his sides, the decision already made. She kept one painting. The Winter Road, the stone farmhouse in the background, the Ohio sky that can't decide. She hung it in the parlor where she spent her evenings. Cal Witter came for dinner on the first Friday of every month. He ate what she cooked and told her things about the county she was still learning, and sometimes he talked about Walter Brauer, and she listened. He had a lifetime of the road's history stored in him, and she was in no hurry. Paula brought her daughters out in August before school started, and the girls picked tomatoes and asked Margaret about her bookkeeping career and whether she'd always lived in Ohio. Nathan called every Sunday, no longer on a schedule that felt like an obligation. He called because he wanted to talk, and Margaret could hear the difference. Derek came in October with his wife and his 2 youngest children. They walked the property on a Saturday afternoon while Margaret made lunch. Derek stopped at the kitchen floor door, which was open, and looked down the stone steps into the cellar below with its jars of preserved tomatoes on Walter Brauer's old shelves. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Dad found this. He found the lock. He left me the key." Margaret set plates on the table. He knew I'd figure out the rest. Derek looked at the key hanging on its hook by the kitchen door. Garden twine, brass, The number 114 worn but still legible. I underestimated you, he said. You underestimated what 72 years makes a person capable of, she said. There's a difference. He nodded slowly. He sat down at the table. They ate lunch together in Walter Brauer's kitchen, which was Margaret's kitchen now, in a stone farmhouse on Harlow Road that Ray had bought in 2001 because he knew the bones were good and believed, without ever explaining himself, that someday the right person would need it. On the last Sunday of October, Margaret sat on the restored porch in the late afternoon. The maples at the back of the property were at full color, orange and yellow against the gray sky. The valley spread out below the hill the way Brauer had painted it, the farms arranged in the low light like something someone had planned carefully and then decided to leave alone. She had Ray's photograph in her lap, not on the windowsill inside, not in her overnight bag. In her lap, where she could look at it if she wanted. She looked at it. He was grinning in the photograph, the way he grinned when he was certain about something. She'd always known when he was certain because he grinned like that, like a man who had already seen how it was going to work out and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. She understood now what he'd been certain about. Not the coins or the paintings. Not the money, not the farmhouse, not any specific thing. Just this, that she was the kind of person who would find it. That whatever was sealed and waiting in the floor of an old stone farmhouse on Harlow Road would be found by her, not because she was lucky, not because she was special, but because she was the kind of person who gets down on one knee in a cold kitchen and presses her palm flat against the boards until she feels the give. The brass key was inside on its hook. The floor door was open. The October light held for a while longer before it went. The letter came in April, forwarded from Harrington and Frew's Columbus office. The envelope was cream-colored, handwritten, with a Cincinnati return address. The woman who'd bought the Valley Panorama at auction wanted to come and see where it was. Made. Her name was Eleanor Marsh. She was 68 years old, she wrote, a retired schoolteacher, and she wanted Margaret to know she hadn't bought the painting as an investment. She'd bought it because she'd grown up on a farm 2 counties east of Wellman County, and the light in the painting was the exact light of her childhood, the specific warmth of an Ohio October afternoon that she had spent 60 years trying to find her way back to. When she saw the reproduction in the auction catalog, she had put her hand on the page before she'd read the estimate. She apologized in the letter for the length of the explanation. She thought Margaret deserved to know where the painting had gone and why. Margaret wrote back and told her to come on a Saturday. Eleanor drove a green sedan and arrived precisely at 10 in the morning. She was a compact, direct woman with close-cropped gray hair and the hands of someone who had kept a garden for a long time. She stood in the gravel road in front of the farmhouse for a full minute before speaking. The stone is exactly as he painted it, she said. He worked from what was in front of him, Margaret said. Come in. They drank coffee in the kitchen under Brauer's framed letter. Eleanor read it from across the table without being invited to, which Margaret didn't mind. The letter was there to be read. He sounds like someone who made peace with being misunderstood, Eleanor said. I think he made peace with something harder than that. He made peace with being right and having no one to tell. Eleanor nodded slowly. She understood that particular condition. After coffee, Margaret took her up the hill behind the farmhouse. The trail through the back field was new, a path she'd worn herself through the spring grass over the past weeks, leading up through the older maples to the crest of the hill where the land flattened briefly before dropping away into the valley below. They stood at the top. The farms were laid out below them in the morning light, the fields going green after the winter, the roads running between them in straight and unhurried lines. In October, Brauer had painted this view in the warm sideways light that turns Ohio fields amber. In April, in the clear vertical light of morning, it was a different thing entirely, cooler and more open, but the bones of it were the same. The same valley, the same arrangement of farms and fence lines, the same hills in the distance holding their distance. He stood here, Eleanor said. More than once, I think. Cal Witter told me Brauer used to walk the hill every evening before dark. Said he could see the weather coming from up here. Eleanor stood with her hands at her sides, looking at the valley the way a person looks at something they have been missing without knowing what to call it. After a while, she said she wanted to loan the painting to the Ohio Wesleyan Retrospective. Dr. Voss had been building the exhibition for 2 years, and it would open in Columbus in November. Eleanor thought the Valley Panorama should go. Not permanently, she wasn't giving it up, but for the run of the show. People in Ohio should see it in Ohio. Margaret said she thought Brauer would have been all right with that. They went back down the hill, and Margaret showed her the cellar. The open door in the kitchen floor, the stone steps, the chamber below with its dry walls and its shelves of preserved tomatoes, its low ceiling, its careful construction. Eleanor stood at the bottom of the stairs and turned slowly. 70 years, she said. 72. And your husband knew something was here. He knew enough to leave me a key and 4 words. Margaret looked up through the open door at the kitchen floor above them, the afternoon light falling across the pine boards. He was a plumber. 40 years in other people's houses. He understood what a building was hiding just by the way it stood. Eleanor looked at the shelves with their jars of preserved vegetables, the ordinary provisions of a working farm replacing what Brauer had sealed away. You turned it back into what it was always meant to be, she said. A room where things keep. They climbed back up, and Margaret walked Eleanor out to her car. The green sedan pulled slowly down the gravel road, raising a thin cloud of dust that the April wind took east. Margaret stood in the road until the car was gone. She was turning back toward the house when she heard another engine. A pickup truck, older, coming from the south end of Harlow Road at the careful speed of someone reading addresses. It slowed when it reached her and stopped. The woman behind the wheel was in her mid-70s. Small, straight-backed, with the particular composed expression of someone who has rehearsed what she's about to say and is still not sure she'll say it right. On her lap, a terrier mix with one ear up and one ear down looked out the passenger window with professional seriousness. The woman rolled down her glass. I'm looking for a woman named Sorrells, she said. Someone at the county housing office said they said she might know about. I'm not sure exactly what I'm asking for. My name is Irene. I've been at my son's house for a year, and it isn't working, and I don't have many other ideas. She stopped. She looked at Margaret with the careful dignity of a person who does not want to ask for help, but has run out of other options. Margaret looked at the woman. The small dog. The rehearsed sentence that hadn't come out the way it was rehearsed. She thought of a January kitchen and a deposit already paid, and a word that meant nothing. Temporary. Pull around back, she said. I'll put the kettle on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.